Welcome everybody to this session of the CEBRA Inflation Drivers and Dynamics webinar. My name is Raphael Schönle. I'm one of the organizers of this webinar series on behalf of the Central Bank Research Association. Dominic Smith is my co-organizer. And without much ado, let me pass on the virtual stage to Rob Ridge from the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, who will be today's moderator. Rob?
Thank you, Raphael. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining the webinar. The topics of today's sessions are inflation and wage expectations of firms and employees, and the expectations of others. I want to express my special thanks to the organizers, Raphael Schönle from Brandeis University and CEBRA, and Dominic Smith from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. As some background information for today's webinar, the webinar is 45 minutes in total with two presentations of approximately 15 minutes each, and then 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A session at the end. Attendees do not have the option to switch on their audio video, but are invited to write comments or questions in the Q&A space. Attendees can, of course, post their questions during a presentation, so you do not need to wait until the end. So please, as the presentations are going on, and if you have questions, please go ahead and submit them. I will then select questions to be answered in the Q&A portion of the webinar after the presentations. The webinar is also live streamed via the CEBRA YouTube channel and is also recorded and made available on the CEBRA website and CEBRA YouTube channel after the event. As a disclaimer, participation in a CEBRA webinar does not constitute or imply an endorsement, recommendation, or favoring endorsement of the views, opinions, products, or services of the Central Bank Research Association or any other participating institution, individual, or entity. All views expressed during a CEBRA or CEBRA co-hosted event are strictly those of the authors, discussants, and other participants, and not those of CEBRA, the co-sponsoring institutions, or any other participating institution. So with all of that as background, I would like to introduce today's speakers. Our first speaker will be Sebastian Link, a postdoctoral researcher at the IFO Institute in Munich, who will be discussing inflation and wage expectations of firms and employees. Our second speaker will be Ina Hajdini, research economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, and she'll be presenting the expectations of others. So with that, I will stop screen sharing, and Sebastian, the floor is yours.
Yeah. So thank you, Rob, for this kind introduction. And of course, thanks to the organizers for putting us in the program. This is not in full screen yet, but it will be in a second. So now, okay, great. I'm going to talk about inflation and wage expectations of firms and employees, which is joint work with Lukas Buchheim from Dortmund and Sascha Mörle, who's also at IFO in Munich. And as the title says, we are interested in inflation expectations and how they relate to wages. Or put it differently, we ask how large is the pass-through of expected inflation to wage growth, which is obviously a key mechanism in a potential wage price spiral. And despite of this key role, we still know relatively little about the effect inflation expectations have on wage setting, because we only have quite a few empirical estimates thus far, which usually point towards pass-through being relatively low. And we know even less about the potential mechanisms behind these estimates. And we want to dig into this by measuring and understanding pass-through using novel panel survey data among German firms and employees in order to first provide a quantitative benchmark of for the size of pass-through of inflation expectations. And what you're going to find and what you're going to see is that the pass-through that we find is very small. It's small among firms and it's even smaller among employees. So depending on the empirical specification, pass-through of firms is going to be between 10 and 25%, which means that a 1 percentage point higher inflation expectation for the next year is reflected in at a maximum a quarter of a percentage point higher wage growth expectation over that period. And with this, we are very much in line with other papers, including a paper by Ina, who is going to be next on US consumers. There's a paper on Canadian consumers. There's there are papers on Swiss and French firms, all coming from different angles, using different methods, but all finding very small degrees of pass-through. And what we add to this is first that we kind of look into both firms and employees in the same kind of setting, and we can have a panel dimension, which means that we can look into different potential mechanisms behind these estimates. And I'm going to dig into the role of wage rigidities, which appear to play a role for explaining low pass-through, and we can look into the role of wage bargaining in this setting. All right, let me skip the contribution in the interest of time and directly introduce you to the data set. So we run our surveys in parallel among roughly 3,000 firms and 1,500 employees in Germany. For firms, we amend the long-standing IFO business survey that some of you might know, and for employees, we run our own online survey. The frequency is quarterly, meaning that we can re-contact our participants every 3 months, which then allows us to, first of all, follow them over time, apply firm or individual level fixed effects, but also assess the role of the prevailing current realized inflation rate at the point in time they fill the survey. We started doing so in December 2021, which was the period in time when inflation was starting to skyrocket in Germany. It's still ongoing. So we now have 8 waves of data, but what I'm going to show you today is based on the 6 survey waves until March of this year. As you all know, we had strong fluctuations in inflation during that period, peaking at a rate of close to 10% in autumn of last year in Germany. All right, so the main variables we use are first the expected CPI inflation rate over the next 12 months, as well as the expected own wage growth over the next 12 months. So for firms, we tailor the question towards the typical employee. So we do not want to have kind of high management, upper management. We aim at a typical employee in the firm. And for employees, we ask them for wages of their current job, holding everything else fixed. We also elicit information on how wages are set and other potential wage determinants that might be important in explaining expected wage growth. We then simply try to relate expected wage growth to expected inflation by regressing one on the other. So we regress expected wage growth on expected inflation, controlling for what we call expected fundamentals. So macro expectations, the expected unemployment rate, the current business conditions of the firm, expected business conditions of the firms, both the firm itself or the firms the employees work at. And then we look at different kind of, we look at the data from different perspectives by adding different kinds of fixed effects, which we can do because we have panel data. So in the first column, we do not apply any fixed effects. Then we add firm fixed effects or employees fixed effects, then time fixed effects, and in the very last one, both of them. Obviously, the identifying variation strongly differs here, and the interpretation of these coefficients is depending on the specification. But what I want you to take away from this is that irrespective of the identifying variation we look at, we get a ballpark of estimates of pass-through that is all pointing towards slightly positive but very low average pass-through, which is larger among employees, firms than among employees. Sorry. Okay. As I said, this is more or less in line with what other papers, including Ina's paper on US consumers, have found. And we now want to look a bit deeper into potential mechanisms. First one that you might directly think about is, okay, well, wages are rigid. They might not directly respond to increases in inflation or just movements in inflation expectations. In order to set ideas here, what we should in order to think about what we should expect from wage rigidities in terms of their influence on the on the pass-through of inflation expectations, we just draw from Werning's brilliant paper of last year that looked at the role of wage rigidities for pass-through. So what he does is he just takes a partial equilibrium perspective where the log nominal wage just follows inflation. Once you now introduce wage rigidities in such a framework, he nicely shows that wage rigidities imply that the average pass-through is usually smaller than 1 in most of specifications of wage rigidities. So what I plot here is the case of Taylor pricing, where you are just have a staggered fashion. You adjust wages at period tau, 2 tau, 3 tau, etc. And what you directly see is, okay, you know that you, once you are in point tau, you know that you are going to reset wages at period 2 tau. So you set the wage anywhere in between the current price level and the wage that you would freely set, so the flex price wage, the target wage that would prevail towards the end of the wage spell, which is then anywhere in between. And as Werning shows, under reasonable calibrations, then the pass-through should be roughly 1/2. He also shows that under state-dependent pricing, pass-through is also smaller than 1, which is both perfectly in line with our estimates that are much smaller than 1. Maybe we are even a bit smaller than his predictions. So this is the first thing that points into the direction of the importance of wage rigidities. The second thing that directly pops up here is the role of backward-looking pass-through. So imagine you're now at period 2 tau. Your current wage is this, and then you have to kind of first make up for the gap that is between your current wage and the currently prevailing target wage, so to speak, which depends on past inflation, the inflation happening in the period before. This means that nominal wages should catch up with realized inflation, which we can directly test or look at in the data by just throwing in the current realized inflation rate, which then gives us that expected wage growth, future wage growth, is associated with past inflation, as just predicted by wage rigidities. Second thing that you can see from here is that for firms, forward-looking and backward-looking pass-through is now roughly comparable size once we run this horse race. But for employees, the expected wage growth is only related to past inflation only. The coefficient of forward-looking pass-through just goes to 0. This also holds once we use the current perceived inflation rate that we also elicit among employees. Okay, so pass-through is also, there's also backward-looking component of pass-through. Third thing that directly comes from wage rigidities that we should expect once wage rigidities are important in explaining pass-through is that the average pass-through is a combination of extensive and intensive margin, meaning that it's important whether you are about to adjust or not. And that pass-through should be large if agents expect to reset wages during the 1 year ahead forecast horizon. And we can also investigate this. We do this in several ways in the paper. I'm just going to present you one of those. And it's the one that exploits the variation in expiring dates of collective bargaining agreements. So a share of roughly 1/3 of the firms in our sample is covered by a collective bargaining agreement. And these collective bargaining agreements have a usual duration of 2 years. And it's then kind of, it's changing over time and across industries of whether you are about to readjust the wage during the next year or not, just depending on the length of the coverage of the CBA. And the idea is that, okay, if the CBA is expiring during the next 12 months, you are about to, you know that you are going to readjust wages. And if it's not, you're not about to adjust. And our prediction would be that those who are not about to adjust, there you should see a lower pass-through. of inflation expectations because it simply cannot adjust the wage strongly. In order to look at this, we merge industry level data on the expiring dates of collective bargaining agreements in order to construct a measure of the percentage of employees that are covered by a valid CBA 12 months ahead. Okay, so this is now the regression again that I showed you before, just for the subset of firms covered by a collective bargaining agreement. And among those, the average pass-through, forward-looking pass-through, is 11%. And the backward-looking component is a quarter, which is then different once you look at those separately that are in industries where collective bargaining agreements are to be expired. So let me again explain you what this thing here is. So the share of valid collective bargaining agreements 1 year ahead is if this is one, wages are fixed for all the employees in the given industry 1 year ahead, still 1 year ahead. You know that today that it's still there. You cannot adjust. If it's zero, you know that you're about to adjust. So for those with a share of zero, pass-through is larger. However, for those who are not about to readjust wages during the 1 year ahead forecast horizon, the sum of the two coefficients turns to zero. Forward-looking pass-through doesn't matter for them. Same thing for the current realized inflation rate. It's just strongly, it's very important and strongly reflected in wage growth expectations of those who are about to readjust, where the share of valid agreements 1 year ahead is zero. However, for those who are still under the same collective bargaining agreements 1 year ahead from now, the sum of the two coefficients turns to zero. So timing really appears to matter, and if you are covered by a collective bargaining agreement that's just running more than 1 year ahead, there's no room for those firms to incorporate wage inflation expectations and the realized inflation rate to their wage growth expectations. Okay, let me spend my maybe last -1 minute on a second perspective on these things. So a second perspective you can take is looking at the role of bargaining pass-through. The idea here is that if you had high inflation expectations, you might search for a new job in order to generate an offer that might give you a counter offer, turning out in a higher wage. Or you might just bargain more often about your wage. You might ask for a pay rise. And this is something we do not find in our data. We find only at most small associations between inflation expectations and on the job search and bargaining intensity, which then gives you another potential reason why pass-through of inflation expectations on wage growth is so low, because people just do not search more intensively, do not initiate wage bargaining more often. Last thing I want to stress here is that we also look into different different degrees of bargaining power along different lines. So, for example, if employees who search for a job, for those we find that pass-through is higher among this group, and it's much lower for those who do not search on a job. We find that positive pass-through only for employees with some say in the wage setting, so to speak. Or in turn, if you are covered by minimum wage, for example, pass-through is zero. And 15% of the German workforce earn the minimum wage. So this again gives you an indication why on average pass-through is low. And lastly, pass-through is higher for those firms who report a shortage of skilled labor, or put it differently, in firms where they do not report shortage of skilled labor, where the bargaining power of employees is arguably lower, pass-through is also lower. All right, let me wrap up here. This was a tour de force through a study on the pass-through of inflation expectations on wage setting among panels of German firms and employees. We find that average pass-through is low for firms, and it's even lower for employees in our setting. We find that this is strongly in line with the presence of wage utilities, because first we find evidence for backward-looking pass-through. So the realized inflation matters for wage expectations, particularly for employees. Pass-through is high at the intensive margin. So timing really matters, whether you are about to adjust your wage or not. Lastly, pass-through via bargaining. We only find limited evidence on that wage bargaining spurs high inflation expectations spur more wage bargaining. And we find that employees having more bargaining power also exhibit a higher pass-through of their inflation expectations to their wage expectations. Thanks a lot for listening.
Thanks very much, Sebastian. As a reminder for our audience, if you have questions, please go ahead and submit them into the Q&A, and then we will be able to get to them after Ina's presentation. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ina, who will be discussing the expectations of others. Ina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rob. First, many thanks to the organizers for extending the invite to talk about this paper. This is joint work with Ezequiel Garcia-Lambertman, John Lear, Matthew Pedemonte, and Raphael Schonle. And since Matthew and I are colleagues at the Cleveland Fed, the usual disclaimer that these are our own views of bias. Okay, so recently there has been a boom in survey data that has enabled a number of us to study how inflation expectations are being formed, among many other very interesting questions. And thus far, the evidence is pointing towards a finding that heuristics and, more importantly, personal experiences, they're crucial when it comes to how people form beliefs about inflation and how they project those beliefs into the future. However, we do live in a very well interconnected world where we learn quite a bit by socially interacting with one another. And here, think about people sharing experiences with friends and families regarding different prices, such as rents, grocery prices, gas prices, and so on and forth. Or think about how many times you'll scroll through Twitter, Facebook, or whichever is your favorite social media platform and learn something new. In fact, the idea that social interaction can affect our beliefs and therefore, by extension, expectations is not new. Many decades ago, Festinger proposed a theory of social comparison, hypothesizing that people evaluate their opinions and abilities by comparison, respectively, with the opinions and abilities of others. And yet, the role of social networks for inflation expectations remains largely unknown. And that's not because this is not an interesting question, but it is primarily because there has been a lack of a sufficiently appropriate data infrastructure that would enable us to study this type of question. And here, what I mean by appropriate is a large and rich data set on individual inflation expectations. And this is exactly what our paper is going to try and do. We will try to investigate the importance and relevance of social networks for inflation expectations, both theoretically and empirically. The paper makes two contributions to the current stance of the literature. First, we're going to introduce social interaction as an explicit and novel ingredient into the memory and recall framework of expectations formation in Bordalo and co-authors. And from there, we're going to derive a number of testable implications based on a newly constructed data set that is the result of the merger of two large data sets. And in particular, what we're going to do with this newly constructed data set is we're going to try to establish the importance of social networks for inflation expectations. The two data sets that I'm referring to is first the indirect consumer inflation expectations, now known by the acronym of ICIE, where we'll make use of over 1.9 million observations. Together with individual inflation expectations, we'll be able to observe the location of respondents at the zip code level, together with their detailed demographic characteristics. And we're going to merge the data set with the social connectedness index, a data set that describes the Facebook connection linkages at the county level. What do we find? So empirically, we're going to find that social networks are indeed a relevant channel for how people form inflation expectations through the lens of the theoretical model. That means that people are attentive to experiences shared via the social network. Our second important result is that common gender networks, they amplify inflation expectations at times of high inflation. Seen from the point of view of the model, that means that these discriminated networks for gender, they increase similarity between the shared experiences in the network and a scenario of high inflation. And finally, and very importantly, we're going to find that generally there is no evidence of local shocks being destabilizers for inflation expectations via networks, with the important remark there that salient local shocks can get inflation expectations closer to the threshold of instability, but we're never surpassing that. And this, from the point of view of the model, means that the total attention that we pay as a society to our personal experiences exceeds our attention, again, aggregated attention that we pay to experiences that are being shared on social networks. So in the interest of time, I'll very briefly mention what we do theoretically. We start off with the benchmark model without social interaction, very closely following two papers of Bordalo and his co-authors. And how does this work? Well, suppose that you're interested in forming some probability assessment around some hypothetical scenario that I'll call this hypothetical scenario K. And in order to do so, what you're going to do is start recalling experiences from your memory database. And then the probability that you recall this hypothetical scenario K is going to depend on the similarity between each one of the experiences in your memory database and this scenario K. And from there, the expectations are going to be formed by relying on subjective probabilities that in and of themselves are stemming from the recall process. Now, what does social interaction do? Well, the social interaction is going to affect the recall probabilities and by extension expectations by extending the set of experiences that you can draw from. Well, how can then social networks become an amplifier for expectations? The general mechanism works as follows. Whenever experiences that are being recalled from the social network add more relevance than irrelevance with respect to this hypothetical scenario of interest K, they can amplify the recall probability and therefore expectations. Right? So for instance, if I were to think of the hypothetical scenario to be scenario of high inflation, then if you recall experiences from the social network that are adding more relevance than irrelevance, right? More experiences that speak more to a scenario of high inflation, then they're going to, the social network is going to amplify the recall probability of the high inflation scenario, and therefore it's going to amplify your inflation expectations. We have a number of implications and theoretical results in the paper that in the interest of time, I'll skip for today and jump immediately to the data sets that we're using. So one of them is the social connectedness index. This index has been constructed by Bailey and co-authors. And this index is constructed as in equation number 1. So essentially, we're taking the Facebook connections between any two counties C and K and dividing those connections by the product of the Facebook users in each one of these two counties. And from there, we're going to define bilateral social connectedness weights between any two counties as described in equation number 2. And you need to think of these weights as a sort of measuring the relative importance of a particular county with respect in the social context. And by construction, these weights, right, they do not really need to be symmetric. In fact, they are generally asymmetric. The second data set that we're going to make use of is the one on indirect consumer inflation expectations. This is a novel way of eliciting consumers' inflation expectations that relies on the indirect utility theory. And the question goes as follows. Given your expectations about developments in prices of goods and services over the next year, how do your income have to change so that you're equally well off to the present, so that you can buy the same amount of goods and services as you do today? To make me equally well off, then my income would have to increase, stay about the same, or decrease. We've been conducting this survey since February of 2021. It's still ongoing. We're receiving about 20,000 responses on a weekly basis. As I mentioned earlier, together with individual level inflation expectations, we're also observing the location of our respondents at the zip code level, as well as their demographic factors. In the present paper, we're going to rely on the monthly variation since the birth of the survey up until summer of the current year. And then combining this ICI measure together with the newly constructed weights, we're going to construct the expectations of others at the county level. So the expectations of others, they're constructed by taking the weighted average of the expectations of any other county as in equation number 3. Now, when we get to the empirics, right, there's a number of challenges that we need to address. So we're going to deploy a 3-step approach. First, we're going to ask whether the network matters. And we prove in the paper that conditional on the network being appropriately identified, an OLS estimate different from 0 will mean that the network matters, right? We can discuss whether the magnitudes have been well identified, but that would be sufficient for us to say that the network indeed matters. The next important question is eventually, well, are social networks appropriately identified? Are they maybe reflecting other linkages? So for instance, think of counties within the same state. Eventually, they're very well interconnected with one another, socially speaking, but they are also very well interconnected, economically speaking, policy-wise, and so on and forth. So to address that, we're going to follow two approaches. First, we're going to remove the close-by counties from the network to discard the effects of local shocks. And the second approach is to enrich the data structure by adding an additional layer to the network. And we're going to do that by discriminating along demographic features so that we're able to control by county time fixed effects that will absorb all of these other linkages. And finally, how do we get to the unbiased estimate? We're going to do that by constructing an exogenous expectation shock to the network so that we can get to the causal impact of social interactions on expectations. And today I'll show you some results regarding the first and the third question in the interest of time. So social interaction, we do find it matters for inflation expectations. How do we show that? Well, we're going to start off with an OLS estimation. We're going to run individual inflation expectations on the expectations of everybody else within the same county and the expectations of others, while controlling by county and time fixed effects. And eventually here, the important coefficient is this beta 2. And we prove in the paper that given that the social networks are appropriately identified, all that we need to show that social networks matter for inflation expectations is that this beta 2 estimate is different from 0. And as you can see in the table right here, the expectations that the beta 2 coefficient is everywhere positive and very significantly so, right, across different specifications. Let me then get to the construction of this exogenous expectations shock in the network. So what do we know thus far? Well, we know that consumers, they tend to use local prices to form expectations. However, we cannot use variation in expectations coming from variation in local prices because prices in themselves are affected by local demand, and therefore they're also affected by expectations. So what we're going to do is use a strategy that we've been using in a different paper. We're going to exploit cross-sectional cross-sectional meaning cross-county variation on the usage of gas by relying on the average use of cars to commute. Okay, so in particular, what we're going to do is regress individual inflation expectations on this interaction between gas prices at the national level and the average usage of cars at the county level. An important thing to mention here is that, of course, we're controlling by county and time fixed effect, but also that the usage of national gas prices instead of local gas prices is intentional so that we can avoid any local influence, and the time fixed effects will eventually absorb all of the aggregate effects. We're going to go one step further, and following the evidence in Dacundo and co-authors, we're going to not take for granted that this psi is the same across genders. In fact, D'Acunha and others, they show that gender differences in inflation expectations, they're coming due to distinct attention paid to certain prices, right? So we're going to discriminate this psi, we're going to estimate it differently for men and women. And from there, we're going to construct a new variable that we're going to call gas effect. That is nothing more but it's telling us the exogenous variation in inflation expectations that is coming because of the variation in the exposure to changes in gas prices. And indeed, as we postulated earlier, this psi, right, is much higher for men than it is for women, totally in line with what is found in the evidence presented in D'Acunha and others. From there, what we're going to do is run an IV regression at the individual level. We're going to regress individual inflation expectations on the expectations of everybody else and the expectations of others, where the latter is being instrumented by the gas effect using the same weights that we use in the construction of the expectations of others. And indeed, what we're going to find, right, in column number 2 is that the expectations of others, right, the estimate of beta 2 is really high. It's about 0.5, significantly different from 0. And from here, I'm not going to have time to talk about it today, but we do show in the paper that given this estimate, we do not find an evidence that local shocks would be destabilizers for inflation expectations via the network, which is somewhat comforting. So to conclude, what we do in this paper is study the relevance and importance of social networks for inflation expectations, both theoretically and empirically. We're finding that social networks are a relevant channel for how people form inflation expectations, meaning that people are attentive to experiences that are being shared via networks. Common gender networks, they amplify inflation expectations at times of high inflation, meaning that such networks increase the similarity between experiences that are being shared on the network and a hypothesis of high inflation. And finally, we find no evidence of local shocks destabilizing inflation expectations via networks. However, salient local shocks such as gas prices, they yield an effect of inflation expectations, of the expectations of others that is higher than the OLS estimate, implying that local shocks can get, salient local shocks, they can get expectations closer to instability. And what that means is that the attention that we pay as a society to personal experiences exceeds the attention that we pay to experiences shared via the social networks. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you, Ina, very much. Again, let me take this opportunity to reach out to the members in the audience, and if they have any questions, please go ahead and submit them in the Q&A. So I'm going to start off with a question from Raphael and Sebastian. This is for you. Raphael's question is, in the exchange rate pass-through literature, the distinction is made between short, medium, and long-run pass-through. You seem to find some differences between firms and employees in your main regression. Could dynamics over medium and longer horizons play a role? Have you tried including perhaps multiple lags of realized inflation rates? And can you ask about longer expectations horizons?
Yeah, obviously this is a great question. Raphael, thank you very much. Despite of the fact that you're now running, so have a nice run. All right. Yeah, it's a very rich question. So obviously, you're completely right. It's not only about short-term, 1 year ahead stuff. So people which is directly coming from the fact that I just showed you, that some wages are fixed over a period of 2 years, especially if they are under a collective bargaining agreement. And what we did a few things on this, and we can certainly do even more because we have the possibility to run these things over and over again. So adding new waves. What we have done, we have elicited 2 years ahead wage growth expectations, and we can look into this, which we have not done yet, but we only have this for one survey wave yet, so I don't know whether there's something getting out of here. We also looked into different lags. It's not really there are no much differences between employees and firms if I remember correctly. But what we can also do is we have inflation expectations also elicited prior to the period in time once we started to ask for wage growth expectations. So we can also look at kind of surprises in inflation expectations, so expectation errors in there and which role they play for wage growth. What we have, and this is the single one, and this is only partially correlated to your question, is we have medium run inflation expectations, and we have looked into the connection between medium run inflation expectations and wage growth expectations, and there we've almost found zero effect. So the short run wage growth expectations do not appear to be related to medium run inflation expectations, especially after controlling for short run inflation expectations. And this is perfectly in line with Werning's finding, who just said, okay, if you know that you are about to readjust the wage in 2 years from now, or in 1 year from now, it's just, you don't care about medium run inflation expectations. And this is what we also find in some waves of our survey. Thank you.
Thanks, Sebastian. Another question from Raphael, but this one is for you, Ina. Can you speculate what the findings might imply for policymakers and for research on inflation expectations going forward?
Sure. Yeah, that's two very good questions, I think. So I'll start from the letter. So we do like to think of this paper as sort of opening the gates for a new channel that might be affecting inflation expectations that, as I mentioned during the presentation, it probably has not been studied because of a lack of desire to go after it, but because of a lack of data infrastructure. So we do think that studying how others are affecting or the experiences of other people are affecting our own beliefs matters, and this deserves a lot more, we believe, a lot more attention, both theoretically, but there's of course other things that people can do empirically. With regards to the effect, the sort of implications for policymakers, I think that maybe the most important one is coming from the stability point of view, or the stability results, right? So the comforting thing is that we do not find local shocks being destabilizers of inflation expectations via networks, right? Which is very comforting. Otherwise, we would be in a situation where we would be maybe looking at maybe even sunspot type of equilibria, where a local shock occurring, let's say in New York City, it would start, having spillover effects in terms of inflation expectations in many other cities, and it would be very easy to get expectations de-anchored, which of course it's not great for inflation and certainly not great for monetary policy. On the other hand, however, right, there's a word of caution there that the saliency of these local shocks might also matter. So, as I mentioned during the presentation, we do find that this effect of the expectations of others on inflation expectations, comes. It's much higher when you look at when you're instrumenting for the expectations of others by relying on gas prices, which is a salient price. So therefore, it means that maybe we need to be also a little bit, maybe a little bit more attentive to salient prices, because we know that people are actually paying attention to them, and those can have spillover effects on the inflation expectations through network that are higher than the average.
Okay, great, thanks. We have time for a couple more questions, and I'm going to substitute for Raphael and ask two of my own, but the first one will be for Sebastian. Can you, in the work that we did, there was a significant amount of heterogeneity in terms of the pass-through. So if you could just briefly summarize it, you may have touched on it, but I think it's really important to note the degree of heterogeneity in sort of pass-through, and briefly touch on that or share your findings. Sebastian, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, there's plenty of heterogeneity, and we can look into many different things here. So as I said, the most important thing that we look at is heterogeneity in anything that is related to kind of bargaining power of employees. So maybe I just stress these things again. So along many different lines that we look at the data, those employees that seem to have some bargaining power, for those we find more positive, a stronger pass-through of inflation expectations on wage growth expectations. So, which means that for the very, very large bunch of employees that just get posted wages or who suffer from a bad bargaining position, we just see that pass-through is very, very low. They think they can do very little and they will suffer strongly. Or exactly. This is so maybe the most important thing. Then you can of course look at the more elderly versus the younger ones, etc. But the most important thing, it's almost always boiling down to kind of the bargaining position of the individual, and then this is strongly related to how strongly they perceive they can make up for inflation again in their wages.
Thanks. So, Ina, I'm going to ask you a very quick question. I know we're short on time, and if there's not enough time, I apologize. One of the things I guess I would ask is for something like inflation, age and the social network that you're interacting with, the age of that might be important. So, for example, people that lived through high inflation in the 70s, not that I'm suggesting that I might have done that, but let's just, for the moment, I guess the question is, when you're asking about the social network, how are you able to control for, or how would you think about age? Because experience will be very much a factor of age, and the particular events would also be impacted, I would think. So if you could just maybe comment on that very quickly, I would be interested to hear.
Sure. So I mentioned, that we're discriminating the network by gender, but in the paper, we actually have all sorts of different forms of discriminating the network. And one of them is by age. And we do find, in fact, that social networks of common age groups, they amplify inflation expectations a lot more than what we're finding on average. So it does seem that I'm just going to speculate here, but it does seem that people that are sharing common demographic factors like age, gender, etc., right? They share similar experiences with one another that gives rise to this amplification channel of inflation expectations through networks.
Okay,
but that's great. A great question.
All right, thanks, Ina. So with that, I think we're at the end of today's session. So I want to thank again both of our speakers, both Sebastian and Ina, for a very interesting discussion. And then in closing, let me remind everyone that the next webinar will be on November 30th, and will feature Minghao Li from Peking University, talking about the anatomy of countercyclical dispersion of price changes, as well as Michael Lamla from the University of Duisburg-Essen, who will be presenting firms' expectations passed through into prices and wages. And the moderator will be Hugh Montag, for a research economist at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So again, my thanks to everyone for participating. Sebastian, Ina, thank you. And to our organizers, to Raphael and Dominique. And we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.